I held the gift box tightly in my hands, careful not to smudge the ribbon. It wasn't expensive, not in the way my family measured worth, but it was thoughtful. Inside were 3 of my favorite books to kill a mockingbird: The Little Prince and a collection of Pablo Neruda's poems. I'd also slipped in a handwritten letter addressed to my niece on her quinceañera. I'd rewritten it 5 times before I was satisfied. The moment I stepped into the party hall, I knew I didn't belong. Crystal chandeliers glittered above, and the room was all shimmer and silk. My cousin flaunted a Louis Vuitton handbag. My brother handed over a gold bracelet, grinning like a magician revealing a trick. Then it was my turn. I placed my small box on the gift table. My sister raised an eyebrow. "Books." "Really?" She scoffed loud enough for the people behind her to hear. Couldn't even spring for a gift card. A few relatives chuckled politely. My father muttered behind me, not quite under his breath. Always too proud, never practical. No one asked what the books were. No one read the letter. They just moved on. Later, as the music swelled and the birthday girl twirled beneath falling confetti, I sat in the corner sipping soda from a paper cup. My box was still there, untouched, half hidden behind a giant teddy bear wrapped in plastic. I left before dessert. No one stopped me. No one noticed. As I walked out, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor, my brother caught up and whispered, "Next time, at least pretend to be successful." I didn't answer. The box of books stayed behind, forgotten, just like I always was. Rain had started to fall by the time I reached the sidewalk. I didn't have an umbrella. I'd forgotten it in the rush to wrap the gift and arrive on time. My dress clung to my legs. Drops slid into my shoes, cold and quiet. I walked. Past the same bakery that once gave me free croissants when I was broke. Past the dry cleaners, where Mr. Jansen always greeted me with "still writing those stories." I didn't correct him. I never had the heart to explain I wasn't still doing it. I never stopped. By the time I reached the corner of Willow and 8th, I stopped. There it was, the bookstore, my second job, my sanctuary. The new releases shelf was lit softly from within. People rarely lingered this late, especially on a rainy Friday. But I did, always, and there it was, my book. Not with my name, not the one my family mocked. It sat there under the pseudonym A.R. Nocturne Spine, delicate and unassuming, like it had something to hide. I placed a trembling hand on the glass, tracing the outline of the title, Where Silence Was Raised. No one knew. Not the sister who rolled her eyes at my thrift store blouse. Not the father who once said, "Writing doesn't feed, you get a real job." Not even the niece for whom I'd written countless bedtime stories, back when she still thought I hung the stars. I stared at the cover. A quiet story about a girl forgotten by her family, a girl who taught herself to disappear. The irony was cruel, maybe poetic. I wasn't sure which anymore. A couple walked by, umbrella shared laughter rising in the night air. I envied their ease, their normalcy, their ability to walk home and be seen. I stood there until my hair dripped and my socks were soaked. Then I turned away. Back to the tiny apartment I rented above a laundromat. Back to a life my family thought was a failure. They didn't know the truth. And sometimes I wondered if I wanted them to. People think writers live in coffee shops sipping cappuccinos and waiting for inspiration, like it's a guest who might drop by. But that's not how it was for me. I wrote on the subway, in cramped bathrooms during bookstore shifts, on napkins during 10-minute breaks between tutoring kids who hated poetry and mothers who only wanted perfect SAT scores. I was a tutor by day, a cashier at Morningside Books by night. Weekends belonged to the library, not friends, not parties, just the quiet hum of pages and the dusty smell of paper that always made me feel enough. My closet door was a battlefield. I'd taped every rejection letter to it, 87 in total. Some were polite. Unfortunately, we're going in a different direction. Some were brutal. This isn't publishable work. But I kept them. They were proof I was trying. Proof I hadn't given up. In those years, I ghostwrote everything wedding vows, blog posts for influencers who could barely spell even a political memoir for a man who'd once asked me if fiction was just made-up garbage. He never knew I added a quote from James Baldwin into his opening speech. He thought he'd thought of it himself. At night, I wrote my words. Stories about invisible girls, about soft power and loud silences, about women who turned their pain into poetry and never apologized for it. No one clapped. No one said, "Wow, look at her, go." But I was building something, word by word, story by story, brick by invisible brick. I remember one night a little girl came into the bookstore, maybe 9 or 10. Her mom was buying cookbooks, distracted. The girl clutched a worn copy of Anne of Green Gables and asked me, "Do you think I could ever be a writer?" I crouched beside her and whispered, "Only if you promise not to stop when they laugh." She smiled. I still think about her sometimes. Because that's what I was doing. Writing through the laughter, through the silence, through the rejections and pitying looks at family dinners. I wasn't waiting to be discovered. I was discovering myself. It was the coldest winter in 10 years. My heat barely worked. I wore fingerless gloves while typing a second-hand scarf looped around my neck, even indoors. That was the season I almost gave up. I remember the night clearly. Snow was falling and my power had flickered twice already. I stared at the blinking cursor for hours. Everything I wrote felt pointless, another invisible piece in an already invisible life. But then I opened a new document. I didn't plan it, didn't outline it, just wrote. It was a short story, barely 3,000 words, titled "The Room with No Applause." It was about a girl raised in a family that praised everyone but her. A girl who kept leaving pieces of herself, her kindness, her imagination, her words as gifts. But no one noticed. Until the day she stopped giving. I posted it anonymously on Reddit under the username Ink with No Name. No expectation, no promotion, just silence. And then a comment. "This made me cry in a Starbucks. Thank you." Then another, "I felt like you wrote this from my own heart." In 48 hours, it hit the front page of IR Writing and RR Short Stories. Tumblr users started reblogging excerpts with watercolor art and quotes in calligraphy. Someone translated it into Spanish, then French, then Tagalog. It felt like standing in a quiet room and suddenly hearing thousands of hands clapping, not for the noise, but for the echo it left inside. 3 weeks later, I got an email. Subject line, "Your words reached Norway." A professor at the University of Oslo had read this story in translation. He taught gender studies and modern literature. He wanted to share my story with his students and with a small progressive publisher he worked with. I thought it was a scam. But then the contract arrived. Real letterhead, real numbers. A tiny advance, yes, but also a promise to publish The Room with No Applause as part of a collection. My collection. They asked me what name to use. I paused and typed AR Nocturne. Within a year, the collection had been published in 17 languages. Libraries in Europe carried it. A high school in Sweden made it required reading. I received letters from girls in Bangladesh, Peru, and rural Kentucky girls who felt forgotten but said the story helped them stay. No one in my family knew. At my niece's birthday, the same year the book was making its quiet rounds, someone asked me if I was still working retail. I smiled and said yes. Because it was true. I still stocked shelves. I still lived small. But something was growing. Something they couldn't see yet. The more my words traveled, the more I disappeared. Every email that came in from teachers, journalists, researchers, all began with "Dear AR Nocturne." And I liked it that way. I refused interviews, declined photo shoots. When the publisher begged for an author headshot, I sent an image of a maple tree in autumn, bright red faceless. They understood. Eventually. It wasn't fear, it was protection. The moment my family found out, it would no longer be about the work. It would be about them and everything they didn't say, didn't do, didn't believe in. So I stayed hidden. But the words didn't. The collection. The Room with No Applause made its way into classrooms. Students debated it in forums. Psychology professors cited it in journals. One even called it a modern meditation on intergenerational gaslighting. I read that and wept into a bowl of instant noodles. Not from sadness, but because someone had seen it. Seen me. One day, Oxford sent an email. a literary conference. They wanted me to give a keynote on anonymous authorship and trauma-informed storytelling. I turned it down, not because I was ungrateful, but because I still worked 2 jobs, because I couldn't afford a passport, and because I wasn't ready to walk into a room and say, "Yes, the girl you called invisible now has a voice." I was still living in the shadow of their laughter, still hearing books. Really, every time I tried to celebrate. At family events, I was still the odd one, the spinster, the stubborn girl who never fit in. At Christmas, someone joked, "You know what would make you happy? A husband who could take care of you." I smiled. They didn't know I was already raising hundreds of daughters and sisters and forgotten selves through every word I wrote. Sometimes at night, I'd sit on my windowsill, watching the glow of apartment windows across the street, wondering how many of those people felt unseen too. Wondering how many stories went unwritten just because someone once laughed at a girl who gave books instead of gold. And still I stayed silent, because sometimes silence isn't surrender. It's sharpening. It was a Thursday. I remember that clearly because my tutoring student had just canceled last minute again, and I was halfway through folding laundry on my couch bed when the phone rang. It was Elena, my editor in Norway. Her voice was shaking. "Are you sitting down?" she asked. I laughed. "I've been sitting for 3 hours. What happened?" She didn't answer right away. Then very slowly she said, "You've been shortlisted for the Nobel Prize in Literature." I blinked. For a moment I thought the line had cut, or that she was joking, but Elena never joked, not about this. What I whispered, "I just got the call, it's real. You, A.R. Nocturne, are one of the 5 finalists." I couldn't move. My hands were still holding a pair of socks, mismatched, I think. My heart beat so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just stared at the blinking cursor on my laptop screen, the same screen I'd stared into for years while writing to no one. Elena kept talking legal forms, confidentiality media, blackout, but her voice faded into a blur. I thought of my father saying no one pays for pretty sentences. I thought of my sister's sneer, "Books really." I thought of the rejection letter that once said, "There's no market for quiet sorrow." And then I thought of my story. The one I wrote in the cold with fingerless gloves. The one about the girl no one clapped for. The one that was now echoing through embassies, universities, and apparently Stockholm. "Are you okay?" Elena asked. "Yes," I replied after a long silence. "Just surprised. You don't sound happy." I let out a breath. "I am. I never thought they'd call my name." She softened. "Well, they did. That night I didn't tell anyone. Not my mother, not my siblings. Instead, I lit a candle by the windowsill and opened a fresh page in my journal. At the top I wrote, "If the world listens now, it's only because I never stopped speaking even when no one answered." The bookstore was hosting a local reading night, Emerging Voices, they called it. I wasn't scheduled to read, but I showed up anyway. Old habit. I liked listening to nervous young writers clear their throats like they were carving space for themselves out loud for the first time. The room was small, lined with mismatched chairs and the scent of cinnamon tea from the staff kitchen. A chalkboard sign out front read, "Tonight A.R. Nocturne, special surprise guest." I didn't write that. Elena had called ahead. I should have canceled, but something in me said, "Go." So I did. I wore my bookstore name tag. No one connected it. When they called my pen name A.R. Nocturne, I stood up. One girl clapped. Then the room followed, politely confused. I read from the room with no applause. My voice didn't shake. I didn't look up until the final sentence. And that's when I saw her. In the back row, my niece. Hair longer now, eyes fixed on me like she'd known all along. After the reading, she approached quietly. No fanfare. Just the weight of something unsaid finally moving. "I read your story," she said. Her voice was small. "I knew it was you, the way the girl in it gave too much, and how nobody said thank you." I swallowed hard. "You weren't supposed to find out." She shook her head. "You always gave me books when I was little. I didn't understand then, but I kept them, all of them." I smiled painfully. "They laughed at that, you know." "I know," she whispered. "They still do." A week later, a text came through from a cousin I hadn't heard from in years. A screenshot, a tweet from the Swedish Academy, the official shortlist. My legal name bold and unmistakable Amelia Reyes Nocturne. And underneath it, finalist, Nobel Prize in Literature. The caption read, "Wait, is this really you, Nobelid?" There was no hiding anymore. No more initials, no more half-lives. My face, the one they called plain tired forgettable, was suddenly newsworthy. In hours, my phone was flooded. It began with a voicemail from my mother. I hadn't heard her voice in months, not since Christmas when I declined the invite. Her message was short but carefully rehearsed. "Hi, sweetheart. We just saw the news. Wow. Your father and I are proud. Truly. We always said you were gifted, didn't we?" No, you didn't, I thought. But I didn't delete the message. Then came the texts. From my brother. "You always had a way with words. We knew you'd do something big." From my sister. "So, Sweden. Huh, that's incredible. We should all come. Make it a family trip." Even my aunt, who once gave me a budgeting seminar instead of birthday cake, chimed in. "Your story was moving. I didn't know you had that in you." They all wanted to come. To stand beside me, to post from the red carpet, to wear the borrowed pride like it had never been dismissed. I stared at the screen flooded with memories. The birthday party, where they rolled their eyes at my books. The whispered comments about being a waste of a college degree. The pitying glances when I couldn't contribute to group gifts or fancy vacations. And now they wanted seats at the Nobel ceremony. I called my niece. She answered on the first ring. "They all know now," I said softly. She sighed. "Of course they do. They want to come to Stockholm." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Will, you let them." I thought about it. About forgiveness. About pretending. About how easy it is to mistake guilt for love. Later that night, I messaged my mother. I said, "You said books were useless. I just proved otherwise." She never replied. But for once, that silence felt earned. Stockholm was quieter than I imagined. The cold bit through my gloves, but the air was clear, as if the city had been holding its breath for something holy. The Nobel venue, gilded, imposing, surreal, didn't feel like a place for someone like me. But there I was. They offered a stylist, a designer gown, a media coach. I declined them all. Instead, I wore a simple black dress. No sequins, no lace, just fabric and honesty. A librarian from Oslo I had met during my early publication days clasped my hand backstage. She said, "Thank you for writing what others were afraid to say." I nodded, swallowing back something too big for words. When they called my name, my real name, I walked to the podium in silence. The applause was thunderous, but I barely heard it. I looked out at the sea of faces, none of them familiar. My family hadn't been invited. Not out of spite. Out of self-preservation. I began. They once laughed at the pages I carried. They said books couldn't change anything, that stories were luxuries for people with time to waste. But I wasn't wasting time, I was building. Every rejection, every overlooked moment, I folded them into sentences. I turned silence into ink, and ink into connection. Today, the world listens to the same words they once tossed aside. A pause, a breath. Then I looked down at the speech I had written by hand and smiled. This award isn't for the child who was celebrated. It's for the child who was forgotten. The girl who gave books instead of gold and was told she'd given nothing. Thunderous applause. Somewhere across the world, I imagined my family watching the live stream. Frozen, silent, maybe even proud. But it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't writing for their approval. I was writing for everyone who ever walked home in the rain, carrying something precious that no one else could see. 1 week after Stockholm, I returned home. No fanfare, no parade, just the familiar sound of my key turning in the old apartment lock. The heater still groaned like a grumpy old man. The window still leaked a whisper of cold air. My life still small, still mine. I didn't unpack the metal right away. Instead, I walked. Past the same bakery, the same laundromat, the same corner where not long ago I stood soaked in rain staring at a bookstore window. I stopped. There, right in the center of the display, surrounded by fresh winter holly and soft lighting, was my book. The room with no applause. A golden sticker was pressed neatly on the cover. winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, and right beneath it in handwritten script, local author Amelia Reyes Nocturne. I stood there for a long time. Then I heard footsteps behind me, soft, hesitant. "Is it weird seeing your name there?" A familiar voice asked. I turned. It was my niece. She wore a blue scarf and held a warm drink with both hands. She looked older somehow, but also right. "I used to walk by here," she said, "and wonder why your books weren't on display." I smiled. So did I. She reached into her bag and pulled something out. A worn, dog-eared copy of The Little Prince, one of the books I'd given her at her quinceañera. It still had my note inside in my messy handwriting. "For when you feel small. So you remember that hearts see best." She looked up. "I read it every time they made fun of me for reading instead of going out." She hugged me, hard. "I'm proud you gave me books." I whispered. They weren't just books. They were a future they didn't see coming. The bookstore bell chimed behind us as someone walked out holding a fresh copy of my book. I watched them go, not because they knew me, but because they'd chosen my words. And then, as we stood in the glow of that small window, I thought about everything. About rejection. About invisibility. About how sometimes the brightest gold isn't the gift people wrap, it's the one they leave behind thinking no one wanted it. I took a breath and said the line I'd waited a lifetime to live. "Gold fades, words remain." And this time I didn't whisper it in the dark. I said it aloud, and the world finally heard.